Paul Jones had awoken feeling worse for wear. This was not unusual considering the length of his flight, and even being in business class had obviously not alleviated the jet lag symptoms he would now need to endure. He had managed to get some sleep to make up the deficiency caused by his flight from the United States, but it would take several days before he felt right with the world. How wrong he was. His hotel room was adequate. For him, it was just a place to sleep and rest. Most of his time would be spent at the conference, as well as at the after-conference meals that he was obliged to attend. As one of the guest speakers, his room was in the same hotel as the event, which was a blessing for him. He had no intention of leaving the hotel grounds until the time came to catch his flight back to the only country he had ever considered home. If he was honest with himself, he just wanted to get this over and done with. Paul did not crave the limelight, as some in his field did, and he was not overly enamored with the prospect of public speaking. He was competent at it, and it didn't hold much nervousness for him, but Paul was just much more comfortable with the intricacies of the microscopic world. As one of the top virologists working for the American Centers for Disease Control, his passion was research, not personable interaction. He tolerated having to deal with others in his field because he understood how important it was to share information for the betterment of mankind. It didn't mean he had to like it. He would have much preferred to have Skyped his talk in, or even better recorded his wisdom so that he could simply then forget about it and go back to concentrating on the minuscule packets of protein that caused so much havoc in the world. Unfortunately, information would not be the only thing he would be sharing today. The viral load in his body was rapidly building. Much of his present ills were indeed due to jet lag, but as the days progressed, his symptoms would become progressively more severe. It would still be several days before the reality of his fate would dawn on him, and by then, he would be back in Atlanta. His future was already sealed. All that had to be determined now was how many others he would take with him. Sitting up in his hotel bed, Paul felt the clamminess of his hands, and even with the air conditioning running at full pelt, there was a sheen of sweat across his body. That was the problem with air travel. As someone so intimately acquainted with human diseases, Paul was fully aware just how hazardous aircraft could actually be. Nothing that a quick shower hopefully couldn't deal with. When he stood up to go to the bathroom, a brief wave of dizziness hit him, but he shook the sensation off. Stepping through it, he made sure the water that he washed himself with was good and hot. Having finished with his shower, Paul left the towel on the bathroom floor, safe in the knowledge that when he returned to this room, a pristine replacement would be waiting for him. The hotel maid who would be servicing his room exactly 97 minutes from now would contract the virus from Paul's discarded linen. She would then go on to spread the disease to every single room on this floor of this hotel, as well as bringing it home to her husband and 2 children. The 2 children, both of primary school age, would then share the virus around their classroom. The challenge with this particular virus, the thing that made it so particularly deadly, was the late presentation of the severe symptoms. For several days, the host body would suffer mild ailments ranging from a slight temperature to a headache that was annoying but tolerable. All through this early stage, the people infected by the virus were able to pass the contagion onto anyone and everyone they came into contact with. This was exactly how it had been designed, for the initial surge in its spread would determine its overall impact. The virus had few limitations. At the moment, it could travel via body-to-body contact, on the droplets of the breath, and through direct exposure to bodily fluids. The natural oils and sweat that coated the skin became a natural medium for the virus to present, to aid in its transmission. In a city like Bangkok, that was so overwhelmed by its population, such a disease dispersed with frightening speed. Paul Jones was going to be shaking a lot of hands today. He would be touching a lot of door handles, pressing a lot of elevator buttons. And then, of course, there was the buffet meal he was actually looking forward to at lunchtime. This hotel did really good food, which was not something Paul would usually admit when it came to foreign countries. How easy it was to deliver the end of all things to the human host. Unlike some pathogens which were surprisingly fragile, this particular virus was a tough little son of a bitch. It could easily survive on man-made surfaces for several hours and was particularly unbothered by UV light. As a non-enveloped virus, Alcohol disinfectant didn't faze it, nor did most readily available hand sanitizers. Maniacs had created something that, in several days, would leave the world's scientific and medical communities in abject terror. It was debatable that even if it had been discovered at this early stage, the upcoming apocalypse could have been prevented. Nobody had yet died from its effects, but the fate of humanity had already been written. Soon the mortuaries would be filled, and the hospitals meant to cure people would become vectors for the disease. Some would claim that Mother Nature herself had created this plague to rid the earth of the human scourge that was ravishing the planet, not understanding mankind's part in the great tragedy. In the end, nature seemed as good an explanation as any as to why the virus had appeared as if from nowhere. There was a knock on Paul's hotel room door. The knock came again, more insistent this time. For a brief moment, he considered not answering. What if he just packed his things, got in a taxi, and took the next flight back to Atlanta? Would that be so bad? It would certainly be good for his sanity. Instead, he fastened the buttons of his shirt and answered the call. The woman on the other side was immaculately dressed, the name badge hanging from her lanyard proclaiming her to be Dr. Summers. Her hair was pulled and tied back almost painfully. In her hand, she held an iPad, and as the door opened for her, she thrust out her spare hand.
Dr. Jones, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Paul shook her hand.
I'm Alice Summers, your liaison for the conference. I have your itinerary for the day if you want to check over it.
It was just a shame that, by shaking Paul's hand, she had bestowed upon herself a death sentence, and the remaining minutes of her life were now ticking away. 5 minutes later, and they were both stepping out of the elevator on the ground floor. Alice led Paul through the hotel's marble-floored lobby and through an expansive corridor that led to the main ballroom. There were people everywhere. The event had roughly 500 delegates, and Paul found himself running a gauntlet of handshakes and greetings from people, most of whom he barely knew. He infected every one of them, even though he made a point of wiping the sweat off his hands before making skin-to-skin contact. The air conditioning took his breath and spread it around the vast room in which he was about to speak. If you were wanting to infect the world with a population-killing pathogen, this would have been the perfect place to start it. The wealth of experience and intelligence in this room was irreplaceable, all specialists and experts from across the world. Everyone here was involved in the fight against disease, and as they mingled, Paul's microscopic companions spread amongst them. There were representatives from 17 governments, scientists from 47 countries. Should a pandemic be unleashed upon the world, it would be these people who would lead the fight against it. And most of them had already been given a death sentence. Even worse, when the conference ended tomorrow, the majority of them would take the virus back with them, to spread it through the ranks of the teams and agencies they worked for. The very generals in the battle against the virus would be some of its first victims. Now free of the masses, Paul stood at the front near the stage, waiting for his turn to speak. His throat felt scratchy as he watched the assorted geniuses slowly take their seats. Every skin-to-skin contact risked spreading the virus through the crowd. Every exhale caused a cascade as it multiplied in the air. Next to him on a raised table, Paul lifted a glass of water and drank heavily. With the receptacle drained, he placed it back down, only for a hotel employee to swoop down and pick it up for recycling. That was the one thing about Thailand that Paul didn't mind: the work ethic. Their understanding of customer service was exemplary because those that had jobs did their damnedest to keep them. Unfortunately, by doing his job with such zeal, the hotel waiter infected himself. Even though he was wearing pristine white gloves, it was enough for the water on the rim of the glass to soak through to touch his skin. Later on that day, the waiter would infect 17 people at the dinner service.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to have you all here today.
Alice said from the front stage. There were still people lingering at the back of the room, but most of the delegates were now actively seating themselves.
If everyone could take their seats, please. We have an exciting lineup of speakers for you today.
The general chatter in the room died off to almost nothing, and the stragglers began to drift towards their chairs. At that moment in time, 7% of the people in the room were infected with the virus. By the time the day was over, That number would be 87%.
I would like to invite our first speaker of the day. Dr. Paul Jones is the Acting Associate Director of Science at the American Center for Disease Control. He is here today to discuss how to combat the spread of international pandemics.
How ironic. How tragic. Alice stepped aside as the crowd gave measured applause, Paul reluctantly stepping up to the microphone. If only he had known that billions were about to suffer from death's impending stampede. And by the time people realized, it would already be too late.